Under the pale light of dawn, the desert was quiet. Too quiet for a place that had seen so much blood and dust. Smoke from the dying campfires still clung to the air, carrying with it the scent of cedar and the faint echo of drums that had ceased hours ago. A young woman stood by a dried creek bed, her shoes torn, her dress coated in sand and tears. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the emptiness in her stomach was only rivaled by the trembling fear in her heart. The nearest town was 3 days' walk west, but she no longer had the strength to move. Somewhere beyond the mesquite trees, she heard the slow tread of hooves and the crackle of a branch underfoot. She froze, clutching the edge of her shawl to her chest. A man was approaching, tall, silent, and wrapped in a worn blanket of dark hide. His hair was long and tied back with leather strips. His eyes, dark as the desert night, did not blink as he studied her. He stopped a few paces away, saying nothing at first. His presence was both terrifying and magnetic. He wasn't like the rough ranchers or the drunk cowhands she had seen in town. There was a calm to him, a patience that felt older than the hills themselves. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears as he looked at the small bundle in her hands. A tin cup, a piece of cloth, and nothing more. Hunger had drawn her this far from the settlement. Hunger, and perhaps something deeper, something she didn't yet understand. The man kneeled near the creek bed and pressed his palm against the earth as if listening to it. The wind caught his hair, and his voice came low and steady, carrying an accent that softened every word. "You should not walk alone out here," he said. "The coyotes watch. The men from the mines, too." She didn't answer. Her throat was too dry, her fear too sharp. The stranger reached into his saddlebag and drew out a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. He broke it in half and offered it to her. She hesitated before taking it, watching him as though expecting a trick. But there was no deception in his eyes, only quiet pity. She ate in small bites, her body shaking as each mouthful met her hollow stomach. When she finished, he poured water into her tin cup and watched her drink. The silence stretched between them until the wind shifted and carried the distant howl of a wolf. He looked toward the horizon where the sky burned red over the canyon. Then he turned back to her and spoke again, slow, almost like a whisper meant for the desert itself. "You have no food, no family. You will not live another night out here alone." She lowered her eyes, her fingers clutching the edge of her shawl tighter. "I have nowhere else to go," she murmured. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. He stood and gestured toward the hills. "My people stay there. We hunt and we trade with the town when they allow it. If you come, you will eat. But if you come, you must live as we live." His words carried weight. She understood he was not speaking of food alone. She didn't respond, only stared at the sand between them, where a small scorpion moved lazily under the heat of the morning. The silence grew heavier until he stepped closer, his voice low enough that it felt like part of the wind. "If you give yourself to me each night," he murmured, "you'll never go hungry again." Her breath caught, and she looked up at him sharply. There was no mockery in his tone, no cruelty. His face was unreadable, carved by the sun and wind, but not unkind. He said it like a man offering a promise, not a demand. Still, her heart raced with confusion and shame. She turned away, staring toward the open desert where the wind carried dust devils across the flats. She thought of the town she had left, the faces that turned away when she begged, the cold stares of women who called her a burden. The preacher's wife had given her a piece of bread and told her to pray for mercy, but mercy had not come. Only this man standing before her like some spirit of the wilderness. He did not move closer. He simply waited. The desert stretched wide around them, and the sky deepened into a cruel blue. She tried to speak but found no words. Hunger made her dizzy. The heat pressed down on her shoulders. In that moment, she wondered if he meant the words literally, or if he was offering something else entirely. A place, a purpose, a way to survive when the world had already forgotten her. She looked up at him again and their eyes met, his dark and steady, hers uncertain and frightened. He turned and walked toward his horse. "The sun will fall soon," he said. "You decide before the coyotes do." As he mounted his horse and rode toward the hills, she stood frozen in the sand, watching the dust trail fade into the distance. The bread still sat heavy in her stomach, a warmth she hadn't felt in days. But his words echoed louder than the beating of her heart. She didn't know what to think, whether to be angry, grateful, or afraid. Yet something inside her stirred, something that had been silent for far too long. She gathered her shawl, looked once more toward the fading figure on horseback, and began to walk after him. By the time she reached the canyon, night had begun to fall. Shadows stretched long across the rocks and the air grew cool. She saw the glow of firelight flickering between the stones, heard the faint laughter of children, and smelled the sweet, smoky scent of roasting meat. The Apache camp lay hidden in a grove near the riverbank, tents made of hide, women moving quietly between them, men sitting in a circle speaking in low voices. When the stranger dismounted and led his horse into the camp, all eyes turned toward her. She felt their stares, curious, cautious, and cold. He spoke a few words to an older woman near the fire, who frowned but nodded. Then he gestured for the young woman to follow. He led her to a small tent set apart from the others. The inside was simple, a blanket on the ground, a clay pot of water, and a single wooden bowl filled with beans. She could feel her hands shaking as she stepped inside. The man stood at the entrance for a long moment, watching her in silence. Finally he said, "Eat. Rest. No one will touch you here tonight." Then he turned and left, disappearing into the shadows outside. She sank to the ground, her legs too weak to hold her. The food was warm, the first real meal she had eaten in weeks. As she ate, she listened to the sounds outside, the drum beats, the faint murmur of voices, the cry of a baby. It was a strange comfort, though fear still gripped her heart. She thought of the words he had said earlier. They carried a weight she couldn't shake, a promise she didn't understand. When the firelight outside dimmed and the camp grew quiet, she lay awake staring at the flicker of shadows on the tent wall. Somewhere nearby she heard the sound of the stranger's voice, soft, speaking in his native tongue. It was a deep rhythmic tone that seemed to soothe the night itself. She turned on her side, wondering who he really was, a savior, a captor, or something in between. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of cedar through the tent. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. She kept hearing his words, each one curling through her mind like the smoke of a dying fire. "If you give yourself to me each night, you'll never go hungry again." She didn't know if he spoke of hunger of the body or hunger of the soul. But she knew one thing. She was no longer the same girl who had walked through the desert alone. Something was changing quietly, in the space between fear and need. And when dawn came, she would have to decide what kind of hunger she was truly willing to feed. The morning sun crept through the cracks of the tent, painting golden lines across her face as she stirred awake. For a brief moment she forgot where she was, the warmth, the faint sound of river water nearby, the smell of smoke and roasted maize. None of it felt real. Then the murmur of voices outside brought her back. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, her mind replaying every word the Apache man had spoken the night before. Her heart beat faster when she thought of his voice, quiet but certain, as if every word had meaning carved into it by the land itself. She didn't know whether to fear him or thank him, but she knew one thing. He had saved her from dying alone in the desert. Outside, the camp had come alive. Women were grinding corn, children ran barefoot through the sand, and men prepared their horses near the water. It was a world apart from the cold, narrow streets of the town she had left behind. There, people turned their backs on her when she begged for food. Here, every face was marked with purpose. Even the smallest child carried wood or fetched water. She stepped outside, blinking against the brightness. The older woman she had seen last night approached her with a wooden bowl of porridge and a calm but guarded expression. Without words, she handed it over. The young woman nodded, whispering her thanks, though she doubted the woman understood. She ate quietly near the fire, watching how life flowed around her in rhythm. The Apache didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, every sound part of a pattern. It was strange to her, both frightening and comforting. She wondered if she could ever belong in such a place. Then her eyes caught sight of him. He was standing a few paces away, speaking to a group of men near the horses. He didn't look at her, but somehow she felt his awareness as if his gaze never truly left her. He wore no shirt now, only leather pants and a necklace of bone and turquoise. His skin was darkened by the sun, his body scarred by the kind of life no preacher's book could describe. The men listened to him with silent respect. He spoke few words, yet his tone carried weight. When they dispersed, he turned his eyes toward her. She froze, unsure what to do. He walked over slowly, stopping beside the fire. "You eat," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She nodded, unsure if she should speak. "You walk with me after," he added. It wasn't a request. She lowered her eyes, whispering softly, "Yes." When she followed him later into the canyon, the air felt heavier, as though the land itself was listening. They moved past the camp, where the noise faded into silence, replaced by the sound of wind weaving through the rocks. He led her to a ledge overlooking the valley below. From there, she could see the stretch of desert fading into the distance, an endless ocean of gold and red earth. "This is where I was born," he said quietly. "My mother lies beneath those stones." He pointed toward a small mound of rocks marked by feathers. She felt a strange pull in her chest. There was no graveyard, no wooden cross, just the open earth, free and wild. He crouched beside the stones, his hand brushing the dust away. "When I was young, soldiers came. They burned our homes, took our horses, and left our dead for the buzzards." His words were flat, but she heard the pain buried beneath them. "We hid in these hills for weeks. We learned to eat what the land gave. The land feeds those who respect it." He turned his gaze to her. "You come from the town. You know nothing of hunger." She frowned, shaking her head. "I know more than you think," she whispered. "They cast me out because I had nothing. I begged for work. I begged for bread. I know what it feels like to starve." He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "Then you understand," he said simply. "Hunger makes people cruel." The wind picked up, tossing her hair across her face. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You could have left me to die like the others." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You remind me of something," he said. "A deer that walks into a fire and does not know why it burns." She didn't understand, but the weight of his voice silenced her. They stood there for a long while, neither speaking. Then he said, "The people will not trust you. They think all white women bring trouble. You must earn your place here." His words carried no malice, only truth. "And how do I do that?" she asked. He glanced at her, his eyes steady. "You live. You listen. You learn. The rest will come." When they returned to camp, the others still avoided her. Children whispered behind her back, and the older women turned their eyes away. She could feel the wall between them, built by years of mistrust and sorrow. That night she sat alone by the dying fire, staring into the embers. She could hear laughter in another tent, the man's deep voice among others. She wondered if he truly meant what he had said to her in the desert, or if it had been just another test. The words still echoed in her mind, haunting her more than hunger ever did. "If you give yourself to me each night, you'll never go hungry again." It wasn't a bargain, she realized. It was a warning of the world's cruel balance. Everything had a price. Days passed, and she began to help the older women gather herbs and fetch water. They spoke little to her, but over time the silence grew softer. She learned their gestures, their rhythm, the way they sang quietly when they worked. The Apache man rarely spoke to her except to give instructions, yet she could sense him watching. Every movement she made, every mistake she tried to hide. One afternoon, while collecting wood near the river, she heard distant gunfire. 2 men from the camp came running down the hill, shouting in their language. Panic spread. She dropped her bundle and looked toward the horizon. Smoke was rising, thin, black, and growing fast. He appeared on horseback moments later, his face grim. "Stay here," he told her. "No matter what you hear." She grabbed his arm without thinking. "Is it soldiers?" she asked, her voice shaking. He hesitated, then nodded once. "They come for the horses. Maybe more." Her heart raced. "You'll be killed." His gaze didn't waver. "If I die, the land will remember." Then he tore free from her grip and rode off into the dust. The hours that followed were endless. The air filled with gunshots and the cries of men. Women hid the children near the riverbank, whispering prayers in trembling voices. She crouched among them, clutching her shawl to her chest. When the noise finally faded, she could no longer tell whether the silence meant safety or loss. Night fell heavy and cold. Some of the men returned, wounded but alive. She searched every face for his, but he wasn't among them. It was near midnight when she heard footsteps outside her tent. She froze, her pulse loud in her ears. The flap lifted, and he stepped inside, his face streaked with dirt and smoke. He was breathing hard, a cut on his shoulder bleeding through the cloth. Before she could speak, he sank to one knee, eyes closed. "You're hurt," she whispered, reaching for the bowl of water beside her. He caught her hand before she could touch the wound. "Do not fear for me," he said quietly. "Fear the hunger that comes after." She didn't understand, but the tremor in his voice made her chest tighten. He stayed kneeling there for a long time, the fire casting long shadows on the tent walls. When he finally looked up, his eyes met hers, tired, unguarded, human. "The soldiers will return," he said. "They saw the camp. They will not stop." She swallowed hard. "Then we run." He shook his head slowly. "We fight, and if we fall, We fall with honor. Outside, the first howl of a wolf broke the night air, long and mournful. She felt it deep inside her, like an omen of what was to come. He rose slowly and turned toward the flap. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow you will need your strength." She wanted to ask him where he would go, but the words died in her throat. He stepped out into the cold, leaving her alone with the echo of his voice and the weight of everything left unsaid. She lay awake until the fire died, the stars above glimmering through the cracks in the tent. The desert was vast and cruel, but in that moment she understood what he had meant all along. Hunger wasn't only of the body, it was of belonging, of survival, of finding someone who would still stand beside you when the world turned against you. And somewhere deep within, she knew that by dawn, something in her life, and perhaps in his, was about to change forever. The next morning broke with the sound of crows circling over the canyon. The air felt different, thicker, tense, carrying the scent of burned wood and gunpowder that had drifted from the skirmish the day before. The woman woke before dawn and stepped outside the tent. The camp was restless. Men were repairing rifles, sharpening blades, and whispering among themselves. The women gathered food and wrapped what little they had in cloth. The older ones prayed quietly near the fires, their faces lined with worry. It was clear now. This place she had begun to think of as safe was no longer safe at all. She searched for him but couldn't find him. The one who had saved her, the one whose voice she still heard in her dreams, was nowhere among the noise and movement. Fear stirred inside her, not for herself this time, but for what would happen to him, to them all. When he finally appeared near the horses, his expression told her everything. Grim, silent, and ready for war. His shoulder was bandaged, but he moved as though he didn't feel the pain. He gave orders in his language, his voice cutting through the wind. Some men would stay behind to guard the children and the elders, while the rest would ride toward the ridge where soldiers had last been seen. She wanted to speak, to tell him not to go, but her throat tightened with words she couldn't say. He turned toward her, his eyes calm but distant. "If they come again," he said, "go with the old woman to the caves by the river. Take the children." His tone left no room for argument. "You think they will find us?" she asked. He looked past her toward the open desert. "They always do." As he mounted his horse, she reached for his arm. "If you die out there," she said softly, "what happens to us?" He looked down at her hand, resting on his skin, and for a moment his eyes softened. "The land remembers," he said again. The same words as before, only now they felt heavier, final. Then he rode off with the others, disappearing into the haze that rose with the morning heat. The camp fell quiet after they left. Only the wind and the crying of a baby broke the silence. The woman gathered the younger ones and helped the old woman by the fire. Hours passed like that, waiting, listening. But as the sun climbed higher, a faint rumble reached them from the distance. Gunfire, then silence, then another volley. The old woman's hands trembled as she clutched her necklace and whispered a prayer. The young woman pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the earth tremble beneath her feet. The sound grew fainter, then vanished altogether. By evening, the men had not returned. The camp was shadowed by fear. Some of the women argued in low voices, wanting to flee before darkness fell. Others refused, insisting they wait for their sons, their brothers, their husbands. The young woman walked to the ridge beyond the camp, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of horses. There was none, only smoke, thin curling trails that marked the distant battlefield. She wanted to run toward it, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt trapped between courage and helplessness. When night came, the cold crept in fast. The children huddled together by the fire while the old woman sang softly to calm them. The young woman couldn't sleep. She sat at the edge of the camp, watching the stars blink over the desert. Somewhere out there he was fighting, or dying. She didn't know which was worse, not knowing or imagining it all too clearly. Then she heard it, the faint sound of hooves in the dark. Her heart leapt, but she stayed still, listening. One rider approached slowly, leading another horse behind him. When he reached the firelight, she saw his face streaked with dust and blood. It wasn't him. It was one of the younger warriors. He slid off his horse and spoke quickly to the old woman in Apache. The women gasped. The young woman stepped forward. "What happened?" she demanded. The boy looked at her, uncertain if he should speak, but finally said in broken English, "Soldiers come again. More than before, many dead. The chief fights still." She felt the ground fall away beneath her. The chief, the one who had saved her, the one who had become her only anchor in this harsh world, was still out there surrounded by enemies. She turned toward the caves, then back toward the darkness. Her instincts screamed to run, but her heart told her to wait. The hours dragged on until just before dawn, when another group of riders returned. They carried the wounded, the dying, and one body wrapped in a blood-stained blanket. For a terrible moment she thought it was him. She pushed through the crowd, her breath shallow, her vision blurring. But it wasn't. The old woman met her eyes and shook her head slowly. No word yet of the chief. Over the next few days, the camp became a place of mourning and dread. They buried their dead near the river under cairns of smooth stones. The women worked in silence, their grief heavy but contained. The young woman helped where she could, carrying water, tending to wounds, and comforting the children who had lost their fathers. Each night she lay awake, wondering if he was still alive. Sometimes she thought she heard his voice carried by the wind. Other times, she saw his shadow in the flicker of the firelight and felt the ache of something she couldn't name. Then, on the 5th night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. She rose quickly, her heart pounding. When she stepped out, the moon was bright over the canyon and he was standing there, dust-covered, exhausted but alive. He looked different, older somehow, his eyes hard from what he'd seen. For a long moment they didn't speak. Then she whispered, "You came back." He nodded once. Not all did. He limped toward the fire and sat down, removing his bandage. Blood had soaked through again. She fetched water and knelt beside him. "You shouldn't have gone alone," she said quietly. He didn't answer. She cleaned the wound, her hands trembling. When she was done, he reached for her wrist, stopping her. "You stayed," he said. She looked at him surprised. "Where else would I go?" she whispered. He said nothing more, only stared into the fire. The silence between them was deep, filled with everything they hadn't said. She wanted to tell him how she'd feared for him, how every sound in the night had felt like losing him again. But the words caught in her throat. She saw the weight in his eyes, the loss, the exhaustion, and knew he carried more than he would ever speak aloud. The next day, he gathered the survivors and began to plan. The soldiers would return with more men. That much was certain. They needed to move deeper into the canyon, where the terrain favored them. He spoke with quiet authority, though his voice was strained. The people listened, trusting him, yet she could sense a growing tension within the camp. Some whispered that the white woman had brought misfortune, that her presence had angered the spirits. She heard their words when they thought she wasn't listening, each one like a knife turning deeper. That night she sat by the river, staring at her reflection in the water. Her hair was tangled, her dress torn, her face no longer that of the woman who had once walked through town begging for bread. She was becoming something else, someone the world might not understand. She didn't notice him approach until his shadow fell beside hers. "They blame me," she said quietly. "For they're dead," he didn't deny it. "They fear what they do not know," he said. "And you are something they have never known." She turned toward him, eyes shining in the moonlight. "Then what am I to you?" she asked. His gaze held hers for a long time before he spoke. "A promise," he said. "And a test." The meaning of his words lingered in the air. She didn't ask what he meant. Some things were better left unanswered in the stillness of the night. In the following days, scouts reported more soldiers approaching from the west. The tribe prepared to move. They packed what little they could carry and buried the rest. The young woman worked tirelessly beside them, determined to prove she wasn't a curse. When she saw him speak to the warriors, planning routes and strategies, she felt both pride and fear. He carried himself like a man who had accepted his fate, and that terrified her more than anything. As the sun set on their last evening in the camp, a sudden gunshot cracked through the silence. Everyone froze. Then chaos erupted. Men shouted, women grabbed children, and horses reared in panic. The soldiers had come sooner than expected. He grabbed his rifle and shouted orders, his voice cutting through the storm of fear. She ran toward the caves with the others. But when she looked back, she saw him standing alone by the fire, his silhouette framed by smoke and flame, facing the oncoming riders. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves. She wanted to scream his name, but no sound came. The old woman pulled her toward the cave entrance, shouting for her to hurry. The night filled with fire and dust, with the cries of men and the echo of gunfire. Inside the dark mouth of the cave, she turned one last time toward the battlefield, her heart twisting painfully in her chest. He was still there, one man against the storm, and she knew this was only the beginning of what the desert demanded from them both. The night was alive with thunder that wasn't from the sky. The sound of rifles echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the red stone walls until it felt like the whole desert was roaring. Inside the dark mouth of the cave, the woman held a small child against her chest, trying to silence its cries. Smoke drifted through the air, stinging her eyes. Outside, flashes of light tore through the night, each one followed by a crack of gunfire. The world beyond the cave was chaos. Horses screaming, men shouting, and the low rumble of explosions that seemed to shake the earth itself. Every instinct in her body told her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The soldiers had surrounded the valley. All she could do was wait, pray, and hope he was still alive somewhere in that storm of fire. The old woman beside her whispered a prayer in Apache, her hands trembling as she clutched her necklace of carved bone. The children huddled together, too frightened to move. One of the younger women peeked through a crack in the rocks and gasped. "They're burning the camp," she whispered. The woman's heart sank. She could see faint orange light flickering against the canyon walls. The tents, the fires, the only home they had, all gone in a single night. She pressed her back against the cold stone, her breath shallow. Then came another sound, a low rumble of hooves growing louder. Someone was coming toward the cave. The women froze. The footsteps stopped just beyond the entrance. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then a familiar voice broke through the darkness. "It's me," he called softly. Relief flooded her chest and she ran forward before she could think. He stumbled inside, his face smeared with blood and ash. His rifle hung uselessly at his side, the barrel bent. "They've brought more men," he said, his breath ragged. "They've taken the horses and the river path. We can't stay here," the old woman protested in their language, but he shook his head. "They'll set fire to the caves next. We have to move before sunrise." He looked at the young woman. "Can you carry a child?" She nodded immediately. He handed her a small boy, barely conscious. "Follow me," he said. "Stay close. Don't speak." They slipped out through a narrow gap at the back of the cave, following a trail that wound upward through the rocks. The wind howled around them, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. She stumbled more than once but kept going, clutching the child tight. The others followed in silence, a desperate line of shadows against the burning horizon. Above them, the stars flickered faintly through the haze of ash. When they reached the ridge, he signaled for them to stop. Below, the valley was a sea of flames. Soldiers on horseback rode through the ruins, their torches throwing long, cruel shadows. The sight made her stomach turn. Everything the Apache had built, their tents, their food stores, their memories, was turning to ash before her eyes. He watched in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with quiet fury. Then he turned away, leading them deeper into the canyon. They walked for hours under the cover of darkness, moving north toward the mountains. The path grew steeper, the air colder. The children cried softly from hunger and exhaustion, but no one dared stop. When they finally reached a narrow plateau, he ordered them to rest. The group huddled together for warmth while he stood guard at the edge of the rocks. She sat a few feet away, watching him in the faint moonlight. His body was still, but his eyes never stopped scanning the desert below. She could see the exhaustion in the way his shoulders sagged, the pain in the way he held his injured arm. "You can't keep fighting like this," she whispered when she finally joined him. He didn't look at her. "If I stop, they win," he said quietly. "They've taken everything but the land, and the land is not theirs to take." His voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, something that sounded almost like despair. She placed a hand on his arm. "You're bleeding again." He glanced down as if noticing it for the first time and then shook his head. "It doesn't matter." For a long time they stood there together, saying nothing. Below them, the flames had begun to die, leaving only smoke and silence. But the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind that comes before another storm. She could feel it in her bones. The soldiers wouldn't stop until every Apache was gone. When dawn began to break, painting the desert in pale gold, he gathered the group again. "We go to the river fork," he said. "There's a narrow pass through the cliffs. They won't follow us there." But before they could move, the youngest scout came running up the path, his eyes wide with panic. "They found us," he gasped. The sound of gunfire echoed again, closer this time. He shouted for the women to move, pushing them toward the trail. "Go, take the children!" The young woman hesitated. "What about you?" she cried. He turned to her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "I'll hold them off." She shook her head violently. "No, you'll die." His expression softened for the briefest moment. "Then I'll die standing." Before she could answer, he was gone, running down the slope toward the sound of rifles. The others fled up the trail, herded by the old woman. The young woman followed last, carrying the same child she'd held through the night. Every step felt heavier than the last. Behind her, the air cracked with gunfire and shouts. She could hear his voice calling out orders, hear the echo of bullets striking stone. She wanted to turn back, to run to him, but the old woman's hand caught her wrist and pulled her forward. "He fights for us," she said in a trembling voice. "Don't waste his fight." They reached the narrow pass just as the sun crested over the horizon. The canyon walls rose steep on either side, glowing red in the early light. They hurried through, hearts pounding, the echo of battle chasing them like a ghost. At the far end, they found a shallow cave hidden behind a cluster of boulders. There they collapsed in silence, too exhausted to speak. Hours passed before the gunfire faded. The young woman sat at the mouth of the cave, staring down the long trail they had come from. Her hands were stained with dust and blood. The child she carried slept beside her, his small face peaceful despite everything. Every sound made her flinch, the wind, the scrape of a rock, the distant cry of an eagle. Each one might have been him, or the soldiers. By evening, the heat had drained from the air, leaving the canyon cold and hollow. She couldn't stay still any longer. The waiting was worse than fear itself. "I have to go back," she said suddenly. The old woman's eyes widened. "You will die if you go." But the young woman shook her head. "He may already be dying. I won't let him be alone." She took only a small knife and a canteen of water, then slipped out into the dark. The sky had turned violet, and a thin crescent moon hung low over the desert. She followed the trail back toward the ridge, her feet aching, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. When she reached the edge of the battlefield, she dropped to her knees. The ground was littered with broken rifles and fallen horses. The sand was stained dark. Then she saw movement, a figure lying half buried in the dust near a burned-out wagon. She ran toward it, her throat tight. It was him. He was alive barely. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his skin pale beneath the blood. She knelt beside him, tears spilling down her face. "You fool," she whispered. "You said the land would remember, but I—" Her voice broke before she could finish. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then steady on her face. "You came back," he murmured. "Of course I came back," she said, pressing her hand to his. "We have to go." But when she tried to lift him, he groaned softly. "It's too late for that," he whispered. "They'll be back soon." She shook her head fiercely. "No, I won't leave you." His hand closed weakly around hers. "You must. Take the others north. There's a village across the mountains. They'll help." Before she could argue, the sound of horses echoed again in the distance, soldiers returning. Her pulse quickened. He looked toward the sound, then back at her. "Go," he said, his voice barely a breath. "Please." She stared at him, torn between fear and defiance, between love and survival. The dust cloud on the horizon was growing larger. There was no time left. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything she had never said, but the words caught in her throat. His hand slipped from hers, falling against the sand. She rose slowly, her body trembling. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of approaching riders. She looked down at him one last time, then turned and ran toward the canyon, her heart shattering with every step. Behind her, the thunder of hooves filled the air again, closer and closer until it swallowed the sound of everything else. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows over the burning desert, and in that fading light, she knew the moment of reckoning had finally come, but the outcome was still waiting, somewhere beyond the next breath of wind. The desert was quiet again, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath after all the gunfire and smoke. The woman ran until her lungs burned, her feet raw and bleeding from the stones. She didn't look back until the canyon swallowed the last echo of hooves behind her. When she finally stopped, the sun had already begun to rise, spilling light over the scorched land. The color of the dawn felt different that morning, less like a beginning and more like an end. Her heart ached with every beat, the memory of his voice still echoing in her chest. The man who had saved her, fed her, taught her to live again, was somewhere behind her in that sea of fire and dust. She didn't know if he still lived, but the earth seemed to hold the weight of his spirit, pulsing through the wind that brushed her face. The trail toward the mountains was narrow, winding through thorn and rock. She stumbled often but kept moving. Her body was weak, but her will had grown iron strong. The child she had carried before was gone now, taken north with the others by the old woman. The promise she'd made, to lead them to safety, was the only thing keeping her from collapsing where she stood. Each step was a whisper of survival, a small act of defiance against everything that had tried to kill her. When the sun climbed high overhead, she reached the ridge and looked down at the valley below. From that height, the battlefield seemed unreal, a dream of smoke and sorrow fading into distance. By evening, she reached a small stream at the edge of the mountain trail. Her hands trembled as she bent to drink. The water was cold and sharp, bringing her back to life one breath at a time. For the first time since leaving the cave, she let herself cry. The tears came quietly, mixing with the dirt on her face. She thought of him, of the way he'd spoken to her that first night, the way his voice had sounded like both a warning and a promise. He had said she would never go hungry again, and though hunger still lived in her body, her soul felt full in a way she couldn't explain. He had given her something no one else ever had, a reason to keep breathing. When night fell again, she built a small fire with what dry wood she could find. The stars above were bright and endless, like 1,000 watchful eyes. She closed her own and whispered into the flames, "If the land remembers you, then I will too." The fire crackled softly, and for a brief moment she swore she could feel his presence in the wind. It wasn't comfort, but it was enough. 2 days later, she found the others. The old woman ran to her, relief breaking through her tired face. The children clung to her legs, crying with joy. They had made it to the far side of the mountains, where the land opened into wide meadows of grass. There was a small village there, built from wood and stone, where people of mixed blood, Apache, Mexican, and a few white settlers, lived in uneasy peace. The villagers took them in, giving them water, food, and a place to rest. The young woman slept for nearly a day without waking, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. When she opened her eyes, the world felt softer, quieter. The scent of bread and wood smoke drifted through the small hut. Outside, the sound of children laughing filled the air. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that they had escaped the endless chase of soldiers and fire. But the peace was fragile, and she knew it. The old woman told her that scouts had gone back to the valley and found nothing but ashes. No one knew what had become of the men who stayed behind. She asked if anyone had seen him, the tall Apache chief who had led them. But the old woman only lowered her gaze and whispered, "The land took him back." Those words stayed with her. She went to the river that evening and sat on the bank until the sun sank behind the hills. The water was clear and slow-moving, reflecting the gold of the setting sky. She picked up a smooth stone and turned it in her hand. The desert had a way of keeping its secrets. Maybe he had died there among the rocks, or maybe he had become part of the wind that now touched her hair. She didn't need to know for certain. His promise had been more than words. It had been life itself. In the weeks that followed, she began to help the villagers rebuild what the war had stolen. She cooked, tended to the children, and learned the ways of the land just as he had once taught her. The people grew to accept her slowly, no longer seeing her as a curse but as one of their own. She carried the strength of his memory in her eyes, and something in her quiet determination made others listen when she spoke. She told the children stories of the man who had saved them, the one who spoke softly to the land and never bowed his head, even when death came close. Seasons changed. The snow came and melted, the rivers swelled, and new grass grew where fire had once burned. Time softened the edges of her grief, though it never erased it completely. Sometimes at night, when the wind blew through the canyons, she would wake and swear she heard his voice again. A low murmur carried on the air, the same tone he had used when he made that promise beneath the stars. "If you give yourself to me each night, you'll never go hungry again." She understood now that it hadn't been a bargain of flesh but of faith. What he had meant was that to survive, she must surrender herself to life, to the land, to the struggle, to the truth that nothing was ever truly lost as long as it was remembered. One spring morning, she climbed the ridge overlooking the new fields they had planted. The wind carried the scent of rain, and far in the distance she could see the faint line of smoke rising from the direction of the old canyon. The sight made her heart stop for a beat. It could have been travelers, or it could have been something else, something that refused to die. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the small turquoise bead she had found near the river weeks ago. She had tied it to a leather string and worn it around her neck. It had been his. She knew it the moment she saw it gleaming among the stones. That night, as the village slept, she walked to the river again. The moon hung low, turning the water to silver. She knelt on the bank and whispered softly, not to be heard but to be felt. "You kept your promise," she said. "I have not gone hungry." The water rippled gently as if in answer. She sat there for a long while, thinking of how far she had come, from the starving girl wandering the desert to the woman who now carried an entire people's story in her heart. When dawn came, she rose and returned to the village. The world was still hard, still cruel, but she had learned that survival was not about strength alone. It was about belonging, to the earth, to others, to memory. She would live on, raising the children who had no fathers, teaching them what he had taught her, that the land feeds those who respect it, that the wind remembers every name spoken with love, and that even in loss there is a kind of peace. Years later, travelers would pass through that mountain village and hear stories of a woman who had come from the desert, carrying the spirit of an Apache chief in her heart. They would see her standing by the fields, the turquoise bead glinting in the sun, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky. Some said they'd seen her speaking to the wind as if it answered back. Others said when she died, the air itself grew still for a moment, as though the desert was listening. And somewhere in that vast, endless silence, where sand met stone and the old fires had long turned to dust, the wind carried two voices instead of one. One belonged to the woman who had once been a stranger to the land. The other, to the man who had taught her that hunger could be more than just the emptiness of the stomach, that it could be the ache of the heart, the yearning for life itself. Together, they became part of the land's story, written not in books but in whispers, carried forever through the desert wind.